My name is Elizabeth Monroe. I am 65 years old, and for the last 40 of those years, I have been the silent, uncredited co-author of the magnificent story that is my husband's life. I am a retired editor, a profession that is, by its very nature, an exercise in invisibility. My world was one of red pens and marked-up manuscripts, of the quiet, satisfying magic of transforming a clumsy, sprawling draft into a sharp, elegant, and powerful narrative. An editor, a good one, does not leave her fingerprints on the page. She simply makes the author's voice clearer, his story more compelling, his world more believable. I was one of the best. My life's work was to take the raw, often chaotic, material of other people's genius and give it shape, structure, and grace. My husband, Richard, is a genius. He is a celebrated architect, a man whose buildings are lauded as masterpieces of modernism. He is handsome, charismatic, and possesses a profound, almost religious, belief in his own importance. Our marriage, for 3 decades, has been my greatest and most complex editing project. He was the brilliant, visionary author. I was his editor-in-chief, his ghostwriter, his publicist, and his archivist. I took the raw material of his talent, and I edited it into a legend. This was my life's great, and almost total, sacrifice. I was once a rising star in the publishing world, an editor with a reputation for discovering new talent and a sharp, commercial eye. I had been offered a coveted position to head the fiction department at a major New York publishing house. It was the culmination of everything I had worked for. But Richard was just starting his own firm. He was brilliant, but he was disorganized. He was a visionary, but he was a terrible businessman. "I can't do this without you, Liz," he'd said to me, his handsome face a mask of such charming, helpless vulnerability. "You're my structure. You're my narrative. Without you, I'm just a collection of messy sketches." And so, I chose. I turned down the job in New York. I chose his story over my own. I became a freelance editor, working from a quiet office in our home, a decision that gave me the flexibility to manage his life. And manage it, I did. I managed his finances, transforming his chaotic billing into a profitable business. I managed his social life, cultivating the right clients, the right patrons, the right crates, the right critics. Saying. It was a magnificent coffee table monolith, a testament to his work. But it was a book he had not written. I had. I spent 2 years of my life in the archives of his firm, sifting through his notes, his sketches, his rambling, esoteric project descriptions. I took the chaos of his creative process, and I edited it into a clear, powerful, and deeply compelling narrative. I wrote every word of the prose that was lauded for its poetic clarity. I was the ghost in his beautiful prize-winning machine. The book was a sensation. It made him a star. And I, his editor, was invisible. At the lavish book launch party, he stood at the podium and thanked a long list of people. He thanked his agent, his publisher, his photographer. And then, at the very end, he gestured vaguely in my direction. "And, of course," he'd said, with a warm, magnanimous smile, "I must thank my dear wife, Elizabeth, for her endless quiet support." Quiet support. That is what he called it. He had taken 2 years of my life, my intellect, my very soul, and he had edited it down to a single, domestic, and utterly dismissive phrase. I had not just supported him. I had created him. I had built the very pedestal upon which he stood, and he had forgotten I was even there. But I accepted it. I told myself it was the price of our partnership, the price of his happiness. I was the editor. My job was to be invisible. I did not realize he was already in the process of editing me out of the story altogether. The first sign that a new and hostile editor had begun to make her own revisions to my life's manuscript was, as is so often the case, a financial anomaly. It was a series of charges on our joint credit card, a card I had always managed. They were small at first, but they were in a language I did not recognize. Charges from a florist I did not use. A reservation at a restaurant we had not been to together. a recurring monthly charge for a parking garage in a neighborhood we never frequented. They were footnotes to a story I was not a part of. The judge in me, the part that had been trained to see the patterns in a narrative, to spot the inconsistencies, was awakened. I did not confront him. A good editor does not accuse an author of plagiarism without irrefutable proof. Instead, she begins to do her own, quiet, and meticulous research. I called my best friend, Anna. Anna is not just my friend, she is my lawyer. A brilliant, sharp, and utterly ruthless divorce attorney, a woman who has spent her life deconstructing the false narratives of unfaithful husbands. Anna, I said, my voice calm, I think I have a new project for you. A work of fiction that needs to be fact-checked. Over the next few months, with the help of a discreet private investigator Anna recommended, the secret, revised manuscript of my husband's life began to reveal itself. The business partner was a young, ambitious, and very beautiful interior designer named Sophia. She had been working with Richard on his latest project, a boutique hotel. Their collaboration, it seemed, had extended far beyond the choice of fabrics and light fixtures. The parking garage was near her apartment, a sleek, modern condo that was far beyond the means of a young designer. The flowers were for her. The dinners were with her. The investigator's report was a brutal, ugly, and irrefutable piece of prose, complete with glossy 8x10 photographs of them entering the condo together, of them kissing in a dimly lit bar. He had not just started a new chapter. He had started a whole new book, with a new protagonist, and I was a character who was about to be written out. The final, public, and exquisitely cruel act of editorial erasure was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It was our 30th wedding anniversary. Richard, in a grand, magnanimous gesture, announced that he was hosting a dinner party. Not a quiet, intimate affair for two, but a grand public celebration. He had booked the private dining room at the very boutique hotel he and Sophia had just completed, the very project that had been the stage for their affair. He invited all our friends, our family, our history. We must celebrate our story, Liz, he'd said, his eyes shining with a sincerity that was a work of pure sociopathic genius. 30 years. A lifetime. It deserves to be honored. I knew, with the cold, sick certainty of an editor who has just read the final tragic plot twist, that this was not a celebration. This was a public execution. My execution. He was bringing me to the scene of the crime, and he was going to make me a witness to the public unveiling of his new, revised life. I agreed to go. I played the part of the happy, unsuspecting wife, and I began to prepare my own, final, and definitive edition of our story. I had the investigator's report. I had the credit card statements. I had the proof. And I had my lawyer. The evening of the party, while I was getting dressed, I made a final call to Anna. Are the papers ready? I asked. They're beautiful, Liz, she said, her voice a low, angry hum. A work of art, the divorce petition, the motion to freeze all joint assets, and a lovely little addendum detailing a claim of marital asset dissipation for the full value of the condo he bought for her. It's all here, in a very handsome, leather-bound folder. Is the courier ready? He's just on standby, she said. Just give me the word, I said, as I clipped a string of my mother's pearls around my neck. Will be given at dessert. I walked into that beautiful, trendy, and deeply haunted dining room on my husband's arm. I smiled. I accepted the congratulations of our friends. I was the picture of the gracious, loving, and entirely clueless wife. And all the while, the editor in me was watching, waiting, proofreading the final, terrible scene, and preparing to write the most important, and the most devastating, final chapter of my entire life. The private dining room of the Hotel Elan, Richard's architectural masterpiece, was a symphony in muted grays and aggressive minimalism. It was a beautiful room and a profoundly cold one. It was a space designed not for warmth, but for display, like the man himself. Our 30 closest friends and family members were seated around a single, massive, polished concrete table. The air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the low, self-satisfied murmur of the successful at play. I sat to Richard's right, the seat of honor, the seat of the condemned. Across the table, strategically placed between my own brother and Richard's oldest law partner, was Sophia. She was breathtaking. She wore a simple, brutally expensive slip dress in a shade of emerald green that seemed to drink the light from the room. She was not behaving like a mistress. She was behaving like a queen in waiting, her manner a perfect, delicate balance of professional respect for Richard and a subtle, proprietary intimacy. She would defer to him, then touch his arm, a fleeting, electric gesture that was a public secret everyone in the room was pretending not to see. The dinner itself was an exercise in sustained, high-wire tension. The conversation was a brittle, sparkling thing, full of talk of art auctions, of summering in the Hamptons, of the savage brilliance of Richard's new hotel. And all the while, I could feel the real story unfolding beneath the surface, a silent, vicious narrative of glances and gestures. I saw the way Richard's eyes would find hers across the table. I saw the small, triumphant smile she would give him when she thought I wasn't looking. They were not just having an affair. They were performing a coup. And this dinner, my anniversary dinner, was their coronation. I played my part. I was the gracious, slightly faded, but utterly devoted First Lady of the Monroe dynasty. I smiled at the jokes. I praised the food. I was a masterpiece of social composure. But inside, the editor was working. I was observing every detail, every nuance, every lie, and I was arranging them in my mind into a final, devastating chapter. The grief, the hot, searing pain of the initial discovery had cooled into something far more useful. It had become a block of pure, cold, and diamond-hard resolve. My mind was a split screen. On one half, I was navigating the treacherous currents of the dinner party. On the other, I was in a quiet, clean, well-lit editing room, my red pen poised. I was no longer a participant in this story. I was its final arbiter, its ultimate judge. I was simply waiting for the author to deliver his final, damning, and fatally flawed manuscript page. The turning point, the moment he handed me the weapon with which I would destroy him, came, as I knew it would, with the dessert course. The waiters cleared the main course plates, and a hush fell over the room. It was time for the speeches. Richard stood up. He tapped his crystal glass with a spoon, a sound that was as clear and as sharp as a breaking heart. He was beaming, a man at the absolute peak of his power, his charm, his self-delusion. "My dearest friends," he began, his voice a rich, warm, and utterly false baritone. "My family, thank you for being here tonight to celebrate this milestone. 30 years. He turned to me, his eyes shining with a sincerity that was the most profound lie he had ever told. 30 years, with this incredible woman by my side. He spoke for 10 minutes. He wove a beautiful fictional tapestry of our life together. He told amusing anecdotes from our early, struggling years. He spoke of my unwavering belief in him, of my quiet strength, of my unerring eye. He was, in effect, reading the acknowledgments page of the book of his life. And he was giving me a small but gracious credit. He was praising the editor, before gently and publicly sending her into a forced retirement. And then he came to the final paragraph, the dedication of his new volume. "But a story," he said, his voice dropping into a tone of deep, philosophical gravity, "is a living thing. It must evolve. It must grow. A true artist cannot rest on his laurels. He must seek new inspiration, new challenges, a new muse." His eyes left my face. They crossed the table. They found Sophia. "In the past year," he said, his voice now a public declaration of love, "I have had the profound good fortune to collaborate with a mind, a spirit, that has reawakened my own. A woman whose passion for beauty, whose fearless vision, has pushed me to create my greatest work." He gestured to the room around us. "This hotel, this is ours." A collective, sharp, and delicious intake of breath went through the room. It was a scandal, delivered on a silver platter. And so, he continued, raising his glass, I want to propose a toast. Not just to the past 30 years, but to the future. To new chapters. To new collaborations. To new creations. He looked at Sophia, a look of such naked public adoration that it was a physical blow. To my partner. My muse. My future. To Sophia. God. He had done it. He had taken our anniversary, our history, our life together, and he had publicly, and with a breathtaking, poetic cruelty, rededicated it to her. But the performance was not yet complete. The final, brutal plot twist was yet to come. As the guests, in a state of stunned, awkward silence, raised their glasses, Sophia stood up. Her beautiful face was a mask of tearful, humble gratitude. She placed a hand, a single, perfectly manicured hand, on her flat, emerald-green stomach. Richard, she whispered, her voice trembling with a perfectly rehearsed emotion. Our future, our greatest creation, is just beginning. I'm pregnant. Checkmate. That was what he thought. That was what YFA thought. A public announcement. A new heir. An unbreakable, biological fact that would render me, my marriage, my entire history, obsolete. They had not just replaced me. They had created my replacement. I watched as the room exploded into a chaos of whispers, of shocked glances, of the frantic, buzzing energy of a story that was now too good, too scandalous, to be true. I watched as my husband went to her, as he kissed her, as he placed his hand on top of hers on her stomach. They were a perfect, triumphant, and utterly monstrous tableau of the new Monroe dynasty. And everyone in that room, every single one of our friends, turned their eyes to me. They were waiting for the reaction. The tears. The screams. The dramatic, messy, and ultimately powerless collapse of the wronged wife. The wife was gone. The editor, the judge, remained. I did not cry. I did not scream. I smiled. A small, serene, and utterly unreadable smile. And I stood up. The moment I stood, a new, more profound silence fell upon the room. My movement was not angry. It was not hysterical. It was calm. It was deliberate. It was the movement of a woman who was not reacting, but acting. I picked up my own champagne flute. The bubbles rose in a slow, elegant, and steady stream. Well, I said, my voice clear, calm, and carrying to every corner of the silent, shocked room. It seems congratulations are in order, Richard, Sophia, on your new project. My voice, my composure, my utter refusal to play the part of the victim, seemed to unnerve them more than any scream could have. Richard and Sophia stared at me, their triumphant embrace suddenly looking awkward, theatrical. Richard, I continued, my voice taking on the warm, familiar, and deeply professional tone of an editor discussing a manuscript. You have always been a master of the dramatic reveal, a brilliant if somewhat predictable storyteller. But I find, as your oldest and most dedicated editor, that I have a few notes on this particular chapter. I let my gaze sweep across the captivated, horrified faces of our guests. A good story, I lectured, is all about structure, about cause and effect, about consequences. And the ending, the final chapter, must be both surprising, and yet, in hindsight, utterly inevitable. I looked at my husband. And your story, my dear, has always had one, fundamental, and now fatal, flaw. You have a tendency to forget your own source material. You forget who holds the copyright. I reached into the elegant evening bag at my side. I did not pull out a handkerchief. I took out my small, simple cell phone. I held it up. Anna, I said, speaking into the phone, I believe the dessert course is ready to be served. And then I simply waited. For a long 10-second count, nothing happened. The room was frozen. Richard and Sophia stared at my phone, then at me, their faces a mask of confusion. And then, the doors to the private dining room swung open. It was not a waiter with a dessert trolley. It was a man, A tall, impeccably dressed man in a dark suit, holding a handsome, leather-bound folder. He was followed, a few steps behind, by my best friend, my lawyer, Anna Dotty. Her face was a mask of calm, professional, and deeply satisfying fury. The courier walked, with a steady, unhurried, and deeply intimidating purpose, through the silent, parted sea of guests. He walked directly to our table. He did not look at Richard. He did not look at Sophia. He looked only at me. "A delivery," he said, his voice a low, professional baritone, "for Mrs. Elizabeth Monroe." "Thank you," I said. "You may leave it here." He placed the leather folder on the table in front of my empty dessert plate, gave a small, formal nod, and then turned and walked out of the room, followed by Anna, who gave me a single, almost imperceptible wink before she, too, was gone. The folder sat on the table, a silent, leather-bound bomb. Richard stared at it, his face now a mask of dawning, sickening, and utter dread. He knew Anna's reputation. He knew what a folder, delivered by a courier in the middle of a dinner party, meant. "What is that?" he whispered, his voice a dry, rasping thing. "This, my love," I said, picking up the folder, the leather cool and smooth and solid in my hands, "is my final edit, my last and most important contribution to your story." I stood up. I walked a few steps to where he and his pregnant, triumphant muse were standing, and with a steady hand and a small, serene smile, I served them. I did not throw the papers at him. I did not make a scene. I simply held out the folder to him, as if I were offering him the dessert menu. "Happy anniversary, darling," I said, my voice a soft, final, and utterly devastating whisper. He took it. His hands were trembling. He opened it, and on the very top of the thick sheaf of papers was the first page of the divorce petition, and clipped to it a single, glossy, high-resolution photograph. It was a picture of him and Sophia, taken 2 nights ago by the private investigator, kissing, silhouetted against the window of the beautiful, expensive, and secret condominium that I, it turned out, now had the power to take from him. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the legal papers. He looked up at me, and in his eyes I saw the full, complete, and glorious collapse of his entire, carefully constructed, and utterly fraudulent world. The story finally had a perfect and inevitable ending. The moment Richard's eyes registered the photograph, the color drained from his face. He looked as if he had been turned to stone, a perfect, handsome, and suddenly very old statue of a man. The leather-bound folder slipped from his numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft, expensive thud, the pages spilling out like the entrails of their dead, secret life. Sophia, seeing the look on his face, bent down to see what he had dropped. I watched as she saw the photograph of herself, of her secret, triumphant love affair, now exposed in the harsh, unforgiving light of a private investigator's flash. Her hand flew to her mouth, her perfectly manicured fingers pressing against her lips, but it could not stifle the small, strangled gasp that escaped. The room, which had been a sea of shocked, silent witnesses, erupted. It was not a loud, chaotic explosion. It was a low, vicious, and deeply satisfying murmur, the sound of a scandal of this magnitude being processed, judged, and instantly disseminated by the city's most powerful gossips. The story of Judge Monroe's retirement party was yesterday's news. The story of Richard Monroe's anniversary dinner was a legend being born. The collapse was not just emotional. It was immediate and brutally practical. I saw 2 of Richard's most important clients, men he had spent years cultivating, exchange a single cold glance, and then quietly, almost imperceptibly, rise from their table and walk towards the exit. I saw the wife of Richard's senior law partner, a woman I had known for 30 years, walk over to my brother's table and place a comforting hand on his arm, a small, powerful gesture of allegiance, of choosing a side. The jury of their peers, the very people whose admiration they had built their lives around, was delivering a swift, silent, and unanimous verdict, and it was guilty. Richard finally moved. He stumbled back, away from Sophia, away from the evidence of his own ruin that lay scattered on the floor. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a desperate, pleading bewilderment. He was a man who had always controlled the narrative, and he could not comprehend how the story had so suddenly, so completely, spun out of his control. "Liz," he whispered, the old, familiar diminutive, a pathetic, desperate plea for a history he had just, himself, set on fire. "How? You are a brilliant architect, Richard," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying to every corner of the silent, watching room. "But you have always had one fatal flaw. You underestimate your editor." Sophia, her initial shock now curdling into a desperate, cornered animal fury, turned on me. "You bitch," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous thing. "You planned this. You did this to ruin us. Ruin you." I replied, a small, cold smile on my face. "My dear, you and Richard did that all by yourselves. I am not the author of this chapter. I am merely the editor cleaning up the mess. And the first edit, as any good editor knows, is to delete the extraneous and fraudulent characters. And then I did the one thing they never, in their wildest, most arrogant dreams, expected. I walked away. I did not wait for the screaming match. I did not wait for the tears. My work was done. The final, corrected manuscript had been delivered. I turned my back on the wreckage of their lives, on the smoking crater of my own marriage, and I walked, with the quiet, steady, and deeply satisfying dignity of a woman who had just filed her final perfect story, out of that cold, beautiful room and into the rest of my life. My old life ended that night, in a room that smelled of expensive lilies and betrayal. My new life began the next morning, with the quiet, satisfying act of changing the locks on my own front door. The divorce was not a war. It was a surgical procedure. Anna, my brilliant and furious lawyer, was the surgeon. Armed with the private investigator's report and 40 years of my own quiet, unassailable integrity, she dismantled Richard's life with a beautiful, legal precision. The secret condominium he had bought for Sophia, purchased with marital assets, was sold, with the proceeds awarded entirely to me. The firm he had built, now tainted by the scandal of his public disgrace, began to hemorrhage clients. He was forced to sell his partnership for a fraction of its former value. He was a ruined man, not just financially, but professionally. The story of his brilliant career had been given a new and permanent, final chapter: hubris and its inevitable fall. He did not fight. He was a man who had lost his audience, and without an audience, his performance had no meaning. He signed the papers, took his diminished share, and, like so many of the flawed characters I had edited over the years, he simply disappeared. I heard he moved to a small, quiet town in New England, a place where no one knew his name, a man finally and irrevocably edited out of the story. Sophia's fate was, in its own way, just as complete. The baby, the one she had so triumphantly announced as her ultimate victory, was her final undoing. Richard, in his ruin, wanted nothing to do with her or the child. She had gambled everything on a future with a powerful, wealthy man, and she was left with nothing but the consequences of her own ambition. She, too, disappeared from the glittering world she had so briefly and so brutally inhabited. And me? I did not retreat into a quiet, lonely retirement. The woman who had taken control of that dining room, the woman who had found her own voice after decades of editing the voices of others, was not done speaking. The editor, I discovered, had her own stories to tell. I sold the large, imposing house that had been the stage for our shared and fraudulent life. I bought a beautiful, light-filled apartment in the city with a study that had a floor-to-ceiling bookshelf and a view of the river. And I went back to work. But I did not go back to editing the works of established, powerful men. I decided to build a new house, a new publishing house, on a new foundation. I founded the Elizabeth Monroe Press. It is a small, independent, non-profit publishing house. We have one simple mission: to publish the stories of women who have, for too long, been the silent, uncredited editors of other people's lives. We publish the memoirs of the wives of famous men, the diaries of the assistants to powerful executives, the stories of the quiet, invisible women who have been the scaffolding for the great male edifices of the world. My life is no longer about polishing the prose of the powerful. It is about giving a voice to the voiceless. My days are filled with the thrill of discovering new writers, of reading raw, honest, and powerful manuscripts, of helping other women, other editors, to finally and gloriously write their own names on the cover of their own books. This evening, I am hosting a small party in my apartment. It is a book launch. The author is a woman in her 70s, the widow of a world-famous painter, a woman who had spent 50 years mixing his paints, stretching his canvases, and managing his career, all while being known to the world as nothing more than the artist's wife. Her memoir, a beautiful, brutal, and breathtakingly honest account of her life, is the first publication of the Elizabeth Munro Press. It is already a bestseller. I look around my apartment, at this room filled with strong, brilliant women, their voices rising in a symphony of laughter and intelligent, passionate conversation. I raise my glass. I spent a lifetime helping my husband write his story, a story that, in the end, was a work of fiction. I learned, in the fire of his betrayal, that the most important story you will ever tell is your own. You must be your own author, your own editor, and your own final and most fearless publisher. My job is no longer to be the quiet support. My job is to be the voice. And the library of stories I am now building is the truest and most beautiful legacy of all.